Hello, I am Dyslexo Boy. This series is about practical advice on how to overcome dyslexia and ADHD while studying in medical school. In this video, I'll be talking about specific tools for essay-style questions and OSCEs. I'll start out with essay-style exam questions, which are honestly the bane of my existence. I'm incredibly thankful that they've been largely replaced by single best answer style questions. However, I did have to complete the GAMSAT to get into medical school, which requires 2 essays in an hour. My first piece of advice is to make sure that your reasonable adjustments include a computer to type up the essays, and make sure that you can touch type. Writing exam essays by hand is a recipe for disaster with dyslexia. My handwriting is bad generally, but if you include the stress of time constraints, then it suddenly becomes an unintelligible mess. If you're using a computer, make sure you don't forget to save as you go along. A lot of computers provided are clunky and old, and I've nearly deleted an entire exam before. Next, you'll want to manage your time effectively. Let's take the GAMSAT as an example. 30 minutes to write a single essay, or 37.5 minutes with 25% extra time. The first 5 minutes should be spent making a plan for your essay. If you've got a scrap of paper and pen, as I recommended in my last video on reasonable adjustments, you should start by making a mind map. I don't like using mind maps for revising, but they are amazing for planning. I found that I think in a very chaotic way. Creating a sprawling mind map filled with different associations and sudden ideas is perfect for translating the way I think onto the page. I'd recommend having a structure for your essay in mind before starting the exam, preferably one which you've practiced during your revision time. This should be something along the lines of introduction, argument A, counter-argument A, argument B, counter-argument B, synthesis of the ideas, summary. Towards the end of your 5 minutes planning period, you should start to organise your mind map under these headings. Next, spend 25 minutes writing up the essay itself. Usually I take no more than 5 minutes for each paragraph under each subheading. I'd emphasise here the importance of not being a perfectionist. At this point, you just want to get as much on the page as you can. If you run out of time, it's better to have a messy but complete argument rather than a half-finished, perfect essay. It's impossible to polish what's not there after all. Try to keep your subheadings you set up before. Save drawing connections you think up as you're writing the material for the synthesis at the end. But make sure that you keep a note of them on the paper as they pop into your head. The point is to put the essay into a linear fashion rather than the wonderfully eclectic mess which we usually think in. In the final 7.5 minutes, you can edit the essay. Don't worry about spelling, but make sure that the sentence structure is coherent. I do this by reading each paragraph aloud, which forces me to focus on what it actually says rather than what I've constructed in my mind. Don't be afraid to reorganise paragraphs either. I've often found that I dance around the point before articulating it. So during editing, I'll often cut out the last sentence of a paragraph and move it to the beginning. This makes my point much clearer. Next, we'll talk about OSCEs. I've always found these easier than other exam types, although I might be biased because I've had very good clinical skills teachers at my university. My practical exam scores are usually 10 to 20% higher than all of my written exams, despite the fact that I don't have any reasonable adjustments while taking practical exams. To me, this further demonstrates that the fact of an exam being in text really limits what you can do with dyslexia. They suit my dyslexia, in other words, and ADHD, and I'm very capable of speaking to others and performing practical skills. However, I don't want to lull you into a full sense of security. OSCEs are difficult and they do require preparation. It's just that they aren't as affected by the dyslexia or ADHD in the same negative ways as text-based exams. The areas which have tripped people up before are making sure that you have a structure, remembering all of your findings during the OSCE, and demonstrating clinical reasoning. Each clinical exam, regardless of whether it's for the heart, lungs, or abdomen, has multiple complex components which are easily forgotten or overlooked if you're under stress. To make sure you don't forget any of the tests that you have to go through, you need to A, have a structure of how to assess the patient, and B, make sure that you practice that structure ad nauseum. I usually start at the peripheries, so looking at the patient's hands, and then moving up the arm, checking the vital signs, so pulse oximetry on the finger, pulse, respiratory rate, blood pressure, and then temperature. This leads us to examination of the head and the face. I then move down the trunk, through the neck, chest, and then over the abdomen, and then to the back. Finally, if there are any tests for the legs, such as pitting edema, I'll go through those before moving on. This is a simple but strict format which allows you to remember everything and put it in a clear, coherent order. In order to become comfortable with this structure, you need to practice it until you can do it in your sleep, because knowing what you're going to be doing in medicine, you might be working during the middle of the night. Ideally, you should practice on anyone who will let you, medical students, flatmates, or family members. Now, this isn't always possible. I was doing my first years of medical school during the height of the COVID pandemic, which is why I have the mannequin that you can see behind me. Now, this is just a simple mannequin for clothes. It was about £30 from Amazon, and it's fairly rudimentary. I've added some symbols on it to indicate abdominal portions and locations for a stethoscope, but not much more. It's not as good as working on actual people, and it's not as good as the models that you get in clinical skills teaching environments. But it is useful because you can practice on it at any time, and it has a decent approximation of the body. Next, we'll talk about remembering information during the OSCE itself. I'd like to emphasize here that you are allowed to take notes during the OSCE, and you absolutely should. Make sure to include the patient's name, age, and date of birth, in addition to any relevant clinical observations you make, because so many people forget this information when feeding back to the examiners, and it's fundamentally important in practice. It's a very easy way to appear professional if you remember what the patient's name and age is. I found using paper makes notes very easy, but it's really cumbersome unless you're taking a history. I have to turn away from the patient to write something down and then turn back to them in order to do the next part of the physical exam. Fortunately, I was provided with a solution by one of the students who has a lot more clinical experience than myself. If you write on the back of a glove, you won't break infection control because you won't be using the back of the hand, and you can easily refer to it when you're feeding back to the examiner. Emergency services use this trick all the time, and I've seen them take off their glove and simply hand it over to a doctor when they're presenting, so they have all of the stats easily there to remember. As for clinical reasoning, this is a skill that will come with time. As you learn more material and practice your exam taking, you'll naturally start to draw conclusions as you go along. However, you can practice this skill with the help of other students. Ideally, revise with 2 other people, one playing the patient and one playing the role of the examiner. So as you're examining somebody is observing what you're doing, and then you can rotate around and help each other in this way. They should know what you're examining for, and ideally devise symptoms that you could encounter during the exam. Consider these as you go along and learn how to assess the information while you're working. In my next video, I'll be talking about how to handle exam stress, the cumulative trauma of exams in dyslexia, and applying for extenuating circumstances. Thank you very much for watching.